They say the dust of Redemption Gulch held the memory of every sin committed under its pitiless sun, a fine red powder that clung to boots and consciences alike. It rose in lazy plumes from the hooves of nervous horses tethered outside the Thirsty Dog Saloon, a place where men's souls were sold for whiskey and their futures for a handful of cards. On this day, however, the merchandise was human. Baron Silas Croft, a man whose heart was as barren as the land he'd stolen, had decided to liquidate his assets. The assets were women, their bellies swollen with futures they would not be allowed to keep. They stood on a makeshift auction block on the saloon's wide, warped porch, their ankles chained, their eyes fixed on a horizon that promised nothing. The air was thick with the stench of cheap liquor, sweat, and the particular cruelty of a Tuesday afternoon. One by one, they were sold. A rancher with eyes like a coyote took a woman with hair the color of wheat. A miner, his face permanently grimed with coal, bought another, his bid a low, guttural grunt. The auctioneer, a man with a stained vest and a voice greased with false bonhomie, rattled off their merits with the same tone he'd use for prize cattle. He spoke of strong backs and childbearing hips, never of the names they once had or the dreams they once held. Soon only one was left. Her name was Ilara. She stood straighter than the others, a pillar of defiance in a world determined to break her. Her hands rested on the proud swell of her stomach, a silent, fierce gesture of protection. Her gaze was not downcast, it swept over the leering faces in the crowd, a queen reviewing an army of worms. The dust settled on her dark hair, a temporary crown of sorrow. The auctioneer faltered. "What am I bid for this one?" he called out, his voice losing its slick confidence. A bit past her prime for field work, perhaps, but still, spirited. The ripple of mocking laughter went through the crowd. A woman with child was a burden, a mouth to feed that offered no immediate return. She was damaged goods, a cracked vessel. Baron Croft, watching from a chair tilted against the saloon wall, sneered. He took a long drag from his cigarillo, the smoke curling from his lips like a venomous serpent. He enjoyed this part, the final humiliation, the public declaration of worthlessness. $20, a man slurred from the crowd, for the trouble of her more laughter. Ilara's jaw tightened, a barely perceptible tremor of her chin the only sign of the storm raging within her. She would not weep. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. The sun beat down, turning the dust to a shimmering haze. Silence descended, thick and expectant. The auctioneer raised his gavel, ready to close the most pitiful sale of the day. And then, from the edge of the crowd, a voice cut through the heat. It was not loud, but it carried the weight of stone and steel. 100. Every head turned. He stood in the shadow of the blacksmith's forge, a tall silhouette against the blinding light. He was a stranger, a man no one in Redemption Gulch had seen before. Dust caked his long coat and his worn boots, but it seemed to lay upon him, not to claim him as it did the others. His face was a landscape of its own, carved by sun and hardship, with eyes the color of a stormy sky. A scar, pale and thin, ran from his temple to the corner of his jaw, a silent testament to a past he did not share. He pushed himself away from the wall and walked forward, his steps deliberate, unhurried. The crowd parted for him as if he were a ghost, a quiet, inexorable force. He stopped before the auction block, his gaze lifting to meet Ilara's. He did not look at her belly, nor did he look at her with the familiar hunger of the other men. He looked at her eyes, and for a fleeting second, the storm in his own seemed to recognize the one in hers. Baron Croft rose slowly from his chair, his eyes narrowing. He did not like strangers, and he did not like things he could not understand. "That's a steep price for used property, friend," Croft said, his voice a low growl. The stranger's gaze shifted to Croft, and the air grew colder. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather pouch. He didn't speak. He simply untied the drawstring and entered a cascade of silver and gold coins onto the auctioneer's podium. The sound was a thunderclap in the oppressive silence. It was more than enough. It was an insult. It was the currency of a man who did not haggle over the price of a life. The auctioneer stared, mesmerized by the glint of real money. The stranger's eyes moved back to Ilara. She watched him, her breath caught in her throat. She saw no pity in his expression, no charity, no lust. She saw something far more terrifying and profound. She saw respect. The stranger turned to the auctioneer, his voice low and final. "She's mine." He then mounted the steps, not with a swagger, but with the weary grace of a man carrying an invisible weight. He produced a small, sharp knife and, with a single, precise movement, severed the rope that bound Ilara's wrists. He didn't touch her skin. He offered no hand to help her down. He simply stepped back, giving her space, giving her a choice she had not had all day. For a long moment, she did not move. Then, slowly, she descended the steps, her bare feet silent on the dusty wood. He turned and began to walk away, not looking back to see if she followed. He trusted that she would. She had nowhere else to go. As she fell into step behind him, a small boy with her same dark hair and defiant eyes darted from behind a water trough, running to her and clutching her hand. Leo! Her son. He had been hidden away, a separate transaction Croft had planned. The stranger paused, looking down at the boy, then at Ilara. A flicker of something, pain, memory, understanding, crossed his face before the mask of stoicism fell back into place. He said nothing, simply adjusted his pace to match the boy's smaller steps. They walked away from the Thirsty Dog Saloon, a strange trio, the silent man, the proud woman, and the small boy who held her hand as if it were the only anchor in the world. The dust of Redemption Gulch swirled around their feet, but for the first time that day, it did not feel like the memory of sin. It felt like the beginning of a story. He led them to the edge of the world, or what passed for it in Redemption Gulch. The homestead was a lonely silhouette against a vast, bruised sky, a place forgotten by God and man alike. The cabin sagged like an old man's shoulders, its windows dark and empty as a skull's eyes. A broken fence leaned at a drunken angle, and the well was a gaping mouth choked with weeds. It was a place of endings, not beginnings. The man, who had yet to offer his name, stopped at the threshold. He gestured toward the cabin with his chin. "The boy can have the small room. You take the other." His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. Ilara looked from the derelict cabin to the man's impassive face. Suspicion was a bitter taste in her mouth. She had been bought, not saved. This was just a different kind of cage, more isolated, perhaps more dangerous. "And you?" she asked, her own voice sharp, a weapon she kept honed. He looked toward the barn, which seemed in even worse shape than the house. "I'll be in there." He turned without another word and walked toward it, his long coat swaying with each step. Ilara watched him go, her hand tightening on Leo's shoulder. She pushed open the cabin door. It groaned in protest. Inside, the air was stale with neglect. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows. But it was shelter. It had a roof. She ran a hand over the rough-hewn table, her fingers coming away coated in grime. She would make it clean. She would make it a home. It was what she did. She survived. The days that followed fell into a quiet, watchful rhythm. The man's name, she learned, was Caleb. She heard it once when a circuit rider passed, shouting the name across the dry expanse. Caleb did not answer, merely watched from the shadow of the barn until the rider gave up and moved on. Caleb was a creature of silence and labor. From dawn until dusk, he worked. He moved with a purpose that was both relentless and deeply weary. He mended the fence, his hammer blows a steady, percussive heartbeat in the vast emptiness. He cleared the well, hauling up bucket after bucket of stagnant water and debris until, finally, the water ran clear and sweet. He patched the leaking roof of the cabin, his shadow moving above her as she worked inside. He never spoke to her. He never entered the cabin. Each morning, she would find a brace of rabbits or a fish, cleaned and ready, on the back step. Each evening, a neat stack of firewood appeared beside the door. He was a ghost who tended to the living. Ilara, in turn, created a world within the cabin's four walls. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed. She washed the windows until the sunlight poured in, bright and unfiltered. She used flour sacks to make curtains. She found wild herbs growing near the creek bed and hung them from the rafters, their scent chasing away the ghosts of neglect. She cooked for herself and Leo, the smell of baking bread a bold declaration of life in the face of so much desolation. And every night, she would leave a plate of food on the back step for Caleb, a piece of bread, a bowl of stew. It was a silent conversation. A transaction of care, not currency. Leo was the bridge between their two silent worlds. The boy, unafraid, would sit on the porch steps and watch Caleb work. He watched the way Caleb's hands, which seemed too large and rough for delicate tasks, could expertly sharpen an axe or repair a leather harness. One afternoon, Caleb sat under the shade of the lone cottonwood tree, carving a piece of wood. Leo crept closer, his curiosity overcoming his shyness. Caleb didn't look up, but he stopped his work, holding out the small object he'd been carving. It was a bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. Its form was simple but perfect. Leo took it, his small fingers tracing the smooth lines. He looked up at Caleb, a wide, trusting smile on his face. From the cabin window, Ilara watched. She saw the way Caleb's gaze softened as he looked at her son. She saw the ghost of a smile touch his lips before it vanished. It was a crack in the fortress of his solitude, a glimpse of the man inside the stranger. Her caution began to yield to a fragile, hesitant trust. She knew nothing of his past, of the wound that was so clearly etched onto his soul. But she knew the language of his hands. They were the hands of a man who built and protected, who mended what was broken. One evening, a storm rolled in, one of those violent desert squalls that tore across the plains with biblical fury. Wind howled, rattling the cabin. Rain lashed against the windows. Leo, startled by a deafening clap of thunder, began to cry. Ilara held him close, murmuring reassurances. Through the noise, she heard a different sound, the splintering of wood. She looked out the window and saw it. A heavy branch from the old cottonwood had cracked and was hanging precariously over the corner of the barn where Caleb slept. Without a thought, she threw a shawl over her head and ran out into the storm, her feet sinking into the mud. She reached the barn door, shouting his name over the wind. "Caleb!" The door slid open. He stood there, silhouetted against the darkness, his shirt soaked through. He looked surprised to see her. "The tree!" she yelled, pointing. He followed her gaze, his expression unreadable. He looked from the branch, to her, to the rain plastering her hair to her face. He stepped out, grabbing an axe that was leaning against the wall. But before he went to the tree, he took her by the arm, his grip firm but not harsh, and led her back to the shelter of the cabin porch. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice a low rumble that was somehow heard over the storm. He turned and walked into the deluge, a solitary figure against the flashing lightning, to fight a battle with a tree to protect a shelter he refused to share. She watched him, the cold rain forgotten, a strange warmth spreading through her chest. It was the first time he had touched her. It was the first time he had given her an order. And in that moment, she knew she was safer in this desolate place with this broken, silent man than she had ever been in her life. The quiet days were a gift, a fragile truce with a world that had offered her none. The steady rhythm of Caleb's work and her own became a kind of music, a somber but reassuring melody. The homestead was no longer a place of endings, it was a sanctuary, built of silence and shared labor. But Ilara knew that such peace was a borrowed thing, a candle flame in a high wind. The wind, when it came, had a name, Silas Croft. Croft was not a man to forget a slight. The public purchase of Ilara had been more than a transaction, it had been a challenge to his authority, a silent rebuke delivered in front of the entire town. Worse, Caleb had settled on the one piece of land Croft had long coveted, a patch of earth everyone believed was worthless, but which Croft, through his own cruel arithmetic of surveying and hearsay, suspected held the region's only untapped spring. Water was power, and Croft considered all power his by right. The first sign of trouble was not a man on a horse, but a change in the air. The birds fell silent one afternoon. The wind shifted, carrying with it a scent of malice that was different from the clean, wild smell of the desert. Caleb felt it first. He stopped his work mending a harness, his head lifting, his eyes scanning the horizon. His posture changed, the weary slump of the laborer replaced by the rigid alertness of a wolf. Elara, watching from the porch where she was shelling beans, felt a knot of cold dread form in her stomach. "Leo," she said, her voice low and steady. "Go inside." The boy, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, obeyed without question. A few minutes later, they appeared. 3 riders, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. They did not ride like honest men. They moved with a lazy, predatory arrogance, their horses trampling the new sprouts in Elara's small garden without a care. They reined in a few yards from the cabin, their leader a burly man with a cruel twist to his mouth. Caleb did not move from the shade of the barn. He simply watched them, his hands empty at his sides, his stillness more menacing than any weapon. "This is Croft land," the leader spat, his eyes flicking from Caleb to the cabin, lingering on Elara for a moment with dismissive contempt. "The Baron wants you gone by sunup." Caleb remained silent. His eyes, the color of slate, gave away nothing. He seemed to be counting them, measuring them, not with fear but with a kind of detached, professional assessment. The silence stretched, becoming a taut wire of tension. The man grew agitated by Caleb's lack of reaction. "You deaf, stranger? Or just stupid?" He nudged his horse forward. "We're here to give you your notice." Caleb's voice, when it came, was soft, almost conversational, yet it cut through the air like a razor. "I hear you." He took one step out of the shadows, into the full light of the sun. "Now you hear me. Turn around and ride away." The man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He exchanged a look with his companions. "Or what? You and the woman gonna throw dirt at us?" He started to dismount, reaching for the pistol holstered at his hip. What happened next was a blur of speed and brutal efficiency. Caleb moved with a suddenness that was shocking, closing the distance between them in 3 long, silent strides. Before the man's hand could close around his gun, Caleb's hand shot out, not for the weapon, but for the man's wrist. There was a sickening crack of bone. The man screamed, a high, thin sound of agony and surprise. Caleb twisted, using the man's own momentum to haul him from the saddle. He slammed him face first into the dust. The other 2 men, stunned into momentary paralysis, fumbled for their own weapons. It was a fatal hesitation. Caleb was already moving toward the second man, plucking the rifle from his saddle scabbard as if it were a child's toy. He didn't aim it. He used it as a club, a swift, disabling blow to the man's shoulder that sent him toppling from his horse. The third man, seeing his companion so easily dispatched, finally managed to draw his pistol. He aimed it at Caleb's back. A gasp escaped Elara's lips. But Caleb seemed to have eyes in the back of his head. He spun, dropping low, and the pistol shot went wide, kicking up a spray of dirt near the barn wall. In the same fluid motion, Caleb tossed a handful of dust into the man's face. The man cried out, momentarily blinded, and that was all the time Caleb needed. He was on him, disarming him with the same cold, practiced skill. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. 2 of Croft's men lay groaning on the ground. The third was on his knees, blinking furiously, his gun now in Caleb's hand. Caleb looked down at them, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, not even breathing hard. The storm in his eyes had broken, and it was terrifying to behold. "Go back to your master," Caleb said, his voice a low threat. "Tell him this is my final notice. Stay away." He tossed the man's pistol into the dirt, a gesture of ultimate contempt. The men scrambled to their feet, helping their injured leader onto his horse. They cast fearful, hateful glances at Caleb, then spurred their mounts and fled, riding as if the devil himself were at their heels. The dust settled. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now, one filled with the echoes of violence and the certainty of more to come. Elara stood on the porch, her knuckles white where she gripped the railing. She looked at Caleb, who stood in the middle of the yard, the rifle still held loosely in one hand. He was no longer just the quiet workman, the sad, haunted stranger. He was a warrior. A killer. Her protector. He finally looked at her, and the mask was gone. In his eyes, she saw the full weight of his past, the ghost of the man he used to be. The violence had not exhilarated him, it had hollowed him out, leaving behind a familiar, bone-deep sorrow. He dropped the rifle as if it burned his hand. He walked to the well, pumped water over his hands and face, trying to wash away the stain of what he'd just done. Ilara came down the steps, her heart pounding. The unspoken questions between them now demanded answers. "Who are you, Caleb?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He turned to face her, water dripping from his jaw. He looked at her, at Leo peeking from behind the cabin door, at the fragile piece that had just been shattered. His gaze was bleak. "I'm the man who makes ghosts," he said, his voice thick with self-loathing. "And the man who runs from them." He looked toward the horizon, in the direction Croft's men had fled. But it seems they finally caught up. The aftermath of the confrontation was a heavy shroud over the homestead. The quiet rhythm was broken, replaced by a tense, waiting silence. Every gust of wind sounded like the hoofbeats of returning riders, every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Leo no longer played outside, but stayed close to Ilara, his small hand often seeking hers, the carved wooden bird clutched tightly in his fist. Caleb worked with a grim, feverish intensity, no longer just mending, but fortifying. He reinforced the cabin door, barred the windows, and spent hours cleaning and oiling a rifle and a pair of revolvers he retrieved from a hidden compartment in the barn floor. They were the tools of a trade he had clearly hoped to leave behind. The silent communion of their shared labor was gone. Now, when their paths crossed, there was a new awareness, a raw and painful knowledge of the violence he was capable of. One evening, as dusk bled purple and orange across the sky, Ilara found him sitting by the newly repaired fence, staring out at the vast emptiness. He was cleaning one of the revolvers, his movements precise and automatic, a ritual born of long and bloody practice. She approached him not with food, but with a question that could no longer wait. She carried 2 tin cups of coffee, the steam rising in the cooling air. She offered one to him. He looked up, surprised, his hands stilling their work. He took the cup, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. The brief contact sent a jolt through her, a current of warmth and fear. "They will come back," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he replied, his voice low. "Croft is a man who can't abide a fence he didn't build or a man he can't break." He took a sip of the coffee, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "You and the boy should leave. Take the horse. Ride west until you reach the next territory. Don't look back." The words were a punch to her gut. After all this, after the silent building of a life from ashes, he wanted her to run. "This is our home," she said, her voice fierce with a protectiveness that mirrored his own. "I will not run." His jaw tightened. He set the cup down and resumed his work on the gun, the soft clicks of the metal a stark punctuation in the quiet. "You don't know what a man like Croft is. He won't stop. He'll burn this place to the ground with you in it just to prove a point." "And what about you?" she pressed. "Will you run?" He finally looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was so deep it was like looking into a grave. "I stopped running when I bought you," he said, the words costing him more than all the gold and silver he'd paid at the auction. "I made a promise once, to a woman, to my wife. I promised I'd keep her and our daughter safe. I was a marshal. I was arrogant. I brought a fight to our doorstep, a fight with a man just like Croft. I thought I could protect them." He paused, his throat working. The setting sun caught the scar on his face, making it glow like a fresh wound. "They died," he whispered, the words small and broken. "The fire. I couldn't get to them in time. I buried what was left of them, and I buried my name, my badge, everything I was. I came here to disappear." Ilara sank to the ground beside him, the cold earth seeping through her dress. The full weight of his sorrow, the source of his haunted silence, settled over her. He wasn't a killer by nature, he was a protector who had failed in the most devastating way possible. Buying her, saving her and her child, it wasn't charity. It was atonement. It was a desperate attempt to rewrite the ending of his own story. "Her name was Sarah," he said, speaking to the ghosts in the twilight. And my little girl was named Lily. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, worn wooden cross, its edges smoothed by countless hours of handling. I made this for Lily's grave. Tears welled in Ilara's eyes, for the woman she never knew, for the child, for the broken man beside her. She reached out and placed her hand over his, the one that held the cross. His hand was trembling. "You didn't fail them, Caleb," she said softly. "Hey did." Men like Croft did. He flinched at the sound of his own name on her lips, as if it were a brand. But he didn't pull his hand away. They sat there in the gathering dark, their hands clasped over the symbol of his greatest pain, a shared silence that was no longer empty, but filled with a profound and aching understanding. The truce was over. The enemy was coming. And this time, Caleb would not be fighting alone. When Croft and his men appeared at dawn 2 days later, they were not a raiding party, they were a small army. There were at least a dozen of them, riding in a wide, confident line, their rifles glinting in the first rays of sun. At their head was Silas Croft himself, his face a mask of smug certainty. He expected to find a terrified squatter ready to beg or a corpse left over from his first warning. He did not expect to find a fortress. He did not expect a war. The first shot came not from the cabin, but from a rocky outcrop 100 yards to the east. It was Caleb. The shot was impossibly precise, striking the hat from the head of the man riding beside Croft. It was a declaration. The men scattered, seeking cover, their arrogant formation dissolving into chaos. Croft roared in fury, directing his men to charge the cabin. "Burn them out," he bellowed. As they charged, a second shot rang out, this one from a window of the cabin itself. Ilara, her face grim and set, held an old shotgun Caleb had given her, its kick bruising her shoulder. The blast of buckshot, while not deadly at that range, was enough to make the charging horses rear in panic, throwing 2 riders. Inside, Leah was huddled in the small root cellar Caleb had cleared out for him, the wooden bird his only companion. He was terrified, but he did not cry. His mother had told him to be brave, and he was trying. The battle raged. It was a fight of strategy against brute force. Caleb moved like a phantom through the rocky terrain he had spent weeks studying, his rifle speaking in sharp, deadly pronouncements. He was not a man fighting for land. He was a man fighting for redemption, and he was merciless. Croft's men fell, one by one, not to kill shots, but to disabling wounds. A shot to the leg, the shoulder. Caleb was systematically dismantling Croft's army, leaving the Baron increasingly isolated and enraged. Croft, seeing his advantage slipping away, did the one thing a coward does when faced with a true fighter: he changed the target. He spurred his horse not toward Caleb, but directly at the cabin, a lit torch in his hand. He would recreate the nightmare that had broken Caleb before. He would burn the woman and child. "Caleb!" Ilara screamed from the window as she saw him coming. Caleb saw it too. A raw, primal cry was torn from his throat. For a heart-stopping second, he was frozen, the old horror rising to claim him. The smell of smoke, the memory of flames, the ghosts of Sarah and Lily. But then he saw Ilara's face in the window, fierce and defiant, not a victim but a warrior. He saw Leo's small face flash in his mind. This was not the past. This was now. And he would not fail again. He broke cover, running with a desperate, reckless speed, firing his pistol as he went, ignoring the bullets that whizzed past him. He was no longer a ghost running from his past, he was a man running toward his future. Croft reached the cabin, tossing the torch onto the dry wood of the porch. Flames erupted instantly, licking up the walls. He wheeled his horse around, a triumphant sneer on his face, only to find Caleb standing directly in his path. The 2 men faced each other, the burning cabin a fiery backdrop to their final confrontation. "It always ends in fire for you, doesn't it, Marshal?" Croft taunted, recognizing him at last. Caleb didn't answer. He lunged forward, grabbing the reins of Croft's horse and dragging the man from his saddle. They fell to the ground, a tangle of limbs and fury. They fought with fists and knives and raw hatred. It was not the clean fight of a lawman, it was the brutal struggle of a man with nothing left to lose against a man who believed he owned everything. As they fought, Ilara worked frantically inside, beating at the flames that were starting to creep through the door with a wet blanket. She would not let this house burn. She would not let her home be turned to ash. Caleb, battered and bleeding, finally gained the upper hand. He pinned Croft to the ground, his hands around the Baron's throat, the same rage that had cost him everything now surging through him. He could end it. He could crush the life from this man and have his vengeance. He looked into Croft's terrified eyes, and he saw the face of the man who had killed his family. But then, through the roar of the flames and his own blood pounding in his ears, he heard Ilara call his name. "Caleb! It's out! The fire is out!" His grip loosened. He looked from Croft's gasping face to the cabin, where Ilara stood on the scorched porch, her face smudged with soot, her eyes shining with fierce pride. He looked at the home they had built. Vengeance would not bring back Sarah and Lily. Killing this pathetic man would not heal his soul. But living, protecting, building, that was the path away from the ghosts. He stood up, pulling a barely conscious Croft to his feet. The remaining men, seeing their leader defeated, had already fled. The battle was over. Caleb was bruised, bleeding from a deep gash on his arm, but he was standing. He was whole. He had faced the fire, and this time, he had won. The silence that fell after the battle was profound, broken only by the crackle of the smoldering porch and the ragged sound of breathing. The sun climbed higher, illuminating a scene of wreckage and victory. Ilara rushed from the porch, her eye scanning Caleb for injuries, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She saw the blood soaking his sleeve, the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. She reached him just as his legs gave out, catching him before he hit the ground. She eased him down, his head resting in her lap. He looked up at her, his stormy eyes clouded with pain but clear of the ghosts that had haunted them for so long. "Is the boy," he whispered, his voice raspy. "He's safe," she assured him, her hand gently stroking his hair back from his forehead. "He's safe. You saved us, Caleb. You saved all of us." He closed his eyes, a shudder running through him. It was the shudder of a man finally laying down a burden he had carried for 1,000 miles. She tore a strip from her petticoat and began to clean the gash on his arm, her touch gentle and sure. He didn't flinch. In that moment, with his head in her lap and her hands tending to his wounds, the last of the walls between them crumbled into dust. This was an intimacy deeper than words, a communion of shared survival and nascent love. Croft, dazed and defeated, was tied to a post of the fence he had tried to destroy. He watched them, his eyes full of a baffled, impotent rage. He was a man who understood only power and currency, and he could not comprehend the force that had defeated him. He could not comprehend the value of what he was seeing. Later that day, as if summoned by the battle's end, 2 riders appeared on the horizon. They were not marauders. They rode with the straight-backed posture of the law. One was a federal marshal, a man older than Caleb, with a kind, weary face. Caleb had known he was coming. He had sent a letter weeks ago, a ghost reaching out from the grave. He had laid a trap not just for Croft, but for his own past. Caleb, with Ilara's help, stood to meet them. He explained what had happened, his voice clear and steady. He omitted nothing. He spoke of Croft's land grabbing, his use of slave labor, the attack. The marshal listened, his eyes occasionally flicking to the bound Baron, then to the fortified cabin, then to the woman and child who stood protectively near Caleb. When Caleb was finished, the marshal nodded slowly. "I knew a man once," the marshal said, his eyes on Caleb. "A good marshal named Caleb Thorne. Lost everything. Just vanished. Glad to see he found something worth fighting for again." He and his deputy took Croft into custody, along with a detailed confession Caleb had forced from him. As they prepared to leave, the marshal looked at Caleb. "There's still a badge for you, Thorne. The territories could use a man like you." Caleb looked at Ilara, at Leo who had emerged from the cellar and was now clinging to her dress. He looked at the scorched but standing cabin, at the small garden, at the vast, open sky that now felt like a promise instead of a threat. I think my jurisdiction is right here, Caleb said, a faint smile touching his lips. I'm home, Marshal. The lawmen tipped their hats and rode away, taking the last shadow of the past with them. The days that followed were days of healing. Ilara tended to Caleb's wounds, and he, in turn, began to mend the wounds of the homestead. Together, they rebuilt the porch, the new wood smelling of pine and fresh starts. They worked side by side, their silences now comfortable, their occasional words meaningful. One evening, as they sat on the new porch, watching the sunset paint the sky, Caleb finally spoke of the last, unspoken thing between them. Ilara, he began, his voice hesitant. When I bought you, I didn't. I never meant to own you. I just wanted to give you a choice. You are free. You have always been free. You and the boy can go anywhere you want. I'll give you the horse, whatever money I have left. Ilara turned to him, her expression soft. She reached out and took his hand, the one that was not scarred by work but by a past he was finally escaping. What if the place I want to be is right here? She asked quietly. With you, a wave of emotion washed over Caleb's face, disbelief, gratitude, and a hope so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He looked at their joined hands, then into her eyes. I am not an easy man, Ilara. I carry ghosts, so do I, she replied. Perhaps they can learn to be quiet together, and in the vast, peaceful quiet of the desert twilight, he leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or hunger, but of homecoming. It was a gentle, reverent kiss that tasted of dust, tears, and the promise of 1,000 sunrises to come. Months later, a new cry joined the sounds of the homestead, the cry of a newborn baby. Ilara's daughter was born as the first winter snows dusted the distant peaks. Caleb held the infant in his arms, his large, rough hands impossibly gentle. He looked down at the tiny, perfect face, and a smile of pure, unadulterated joy transformed him. The last of the storm in his eyes had passed, leaving behind a sky as clear and hopeful as the one above them. Leo, now a confident and happy boy, leaned against Caleb's leg, peering at his new sister. Ilara watched them from the doorway of the cabin, her heart full to bursting. The homestead was no longer a sanctuary from the world, it was the center of it. It was a place of laughter, of growing things, of life wrested from the hard, unforgiving earth. They say the dust of redemption Gulch learned a new memory that year. It was not a memory of sin or sorrow, but of grace. It was the story of a broken marshal who found his redemption not in a badge, but in the love of a resilient woman. It was the story of a family forged in fire, a home built on a foundation of courage, and a love that was strong enough to make even the desert bloom.